Hey, I don't want to waste any of my own time here, so I'll start as close to on time as possible. I got to tell you, I haven't been this nervous since the day I was married, but that worked out okay. In fact, my wife Marianne is here, and she can raise her hand. And 39 years is nothing. We've been married for 44 years, and still counting. So first, thanks to our guests for taking time out on a busy Friday afternoon at the end of the semester to join in this celebration, and thanks to my students who are up here in the orchestra seats for agreeing to move to our familiar, comfortable case study classroom here at Wellesley, thanks to David Lindauer, actually, who gets credit for the redesign of Pendleton East into this slightly different but a little bit larger format. The one thing, before I forget, the one thing I want to remind my students of, the most important thing of all to remember, is Sunday is Mother's Day. Okay. So this has been billed as my last lecture at Wellesley, but we have to remember that for a number of my graduating seniors and for a number of your graduating seniors, this is their last lecture to sit through at Wellesley. So it's a celebration for them as much as it is for me. In a sense, I'm graduating along with the class of 2015. But it took me 39 years instead of 4 years. So for our visitors, for the benefit of our visitors, I did not make copies of and distribute the course syllabus. This is a class on international economic policy, a political science class on international economic policy. I've taught a lot of classes in political science since I first came to Wellesley. In fact, in my first 2 years at Wellesley, I taught 8 entirely different courses. This is back when we were teaching 5 courses a year. Some of you may remember that. I taught Introduction to Politics. I taught Introduction to International Relations. I taught U.S. foreign policy. I taught comparative foreign policy. I taught international security policy. I taught a course on international food politics. I taught a course on the American presidency. But I also taught this course on international economic policy. I've been teaching it really continuously since I first came to Wellesley. This is the 26th meeting of the semester. Actually, because of the snowpocalypse, this was the 25th meeting of the semester. But we got through the syllabus on time. This is a class that has probably challenged me more than any other that I've taught, and I think it's challenged my students as well, because it's a course that talks about politics and economics. It's a course that focuses on how the policies of national governments in particular shape the global economy. So if you come into this class as a straight political science major, you're going to have to learn a lot about markets. If you come into this class as a straight econ major, you're going to have to learn a lot in a hurry about not just national governments, but intergovernmental organizations, the structure of political institutions in the global economy. And my students have I think they've taken to this challenge effectively. I judge that from the only written work I've received so far, and that was the first essay assignment, which was a pretty strenuous challenge at cross-training between economics and political science. This was an assigned critical essay. The students were told to examine the theoretical approaches of 3 different scholars. One was Danny Roderick, who is an acclaimed Turkish economist and a theorist of globalization. He has a theory to explain the deeper integration of the world economy. The second was Charles Kindleberger, an economic historian who had his own theory to explain the integration or the disintegration of the global economy. And the third was Dan Dresner, who's a political scientist who teaches at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, who wrote a book just last year that purports to explain why the world economy sometimes remains open and sometimes does not, particularly under the stress of a financial crisis. So my students read these three theories, and then I asked them to rate these three theories as to how well they accounted for policy responses of other governments to the rise of China over the last 2 decades. So there were a lot of moving parts in this assignment, but I got some fantastic papers, some of the best I've ever had at Wellesley, so I know I'm working with some good material here. The second paper assignment was actually due last night to me by email attachment by 11:59 p.m. My suspicion is that some of my seniors punched this off to me at 11:59 and then proceeded to prank my office door immediately just to teach me a lesson. But this assignment was the student's choice of a research problem at the intersection of politics and economics in international affairs. And I've taken just a quick look at the papers that came in and the topics covered, and I'm going to look forward to working through these papers, because it's not a lot of students on one topic, it's a lot of students each with her own topic. And I thought to start the class today, since this will be the last chance my students get to learn really what some of their classmates selected for topics, I would surprise my students, my possibly sleep-deprived students, and ask them to share with us all, particularly with their classmates, 3 or 4 sentences describing the research problem that they chose and the conclusion that they reached. So I've been cold calling on my students all semester, so this should not be a surprise to them. I'm going to start with Cassidy. Cassidy, you don't have to stand up. You can speak from where you are. I'm told that the microphone has a shotgun feature. Don't be frightened by the shotgun.
So my paper was talking about the negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran regarding economic sanctions placed on Iran because of their nuclear program. And so I was talking about how, despite the fact that the P5+1 is in a really good place economically with Iran, because of low oil prices, interest capture and outside political pressure still remain the driving force behind each individual world power's actions in the negotiations. So even though France is appearing very tough on Iran in the public sphere, in reality there's still a lot of interest capture, particularly from corporations and economic interests behind that.
Okay, very good. Interest capture is one of the explanatory themes introduced in one of the readings that we read early in the semester, and I'm glad you're applying it to this particular case. It's an interesting puzzle. Why would Iran seem to be more eager to sanction, why would France be more eager to sanction Iran than the United States? In this case, you've got a nice puzzle to solve. Okay, thanks. Renee.
My paper is called Exclusive Union, based on talking about European Union in light of the immigration crisis that we all know has been a very big problem. I'm examining how the European Union as a whole deals with this immigration problem, specifically looking at the theory of neo-functionalism and liberal intergovernmentalism, and by looking at their immigration policy throughout since the Union was formed, to see how the Union has fit into this framework. And I tie in the current events to see the responses and the negative reactions from each nation to see if it fits neo-functionalism or liberal intergovernmentalism, and I concluded that it's liberal intergovernmentalism.
Okay, all right. If you can simply say neo-functionalism and liberal intergovernmentalism, you've already got a B+ in the class. It looks good. Cleo, let me turn to Cleo.
I started investigating why Finland might have joined the euro and why Finland might now be considering exiting the euro, because we're all pretty familiar with the idea of Brexit with the Greek default, but the Finnish economy is actually in a pretty bad recession due to the collapse of Nokia, and one of the reasons that they joined the euro in the first place was to boost Nokia's exports to the rest of the European Union, because joining the euro made their exports cheaper to the rest of the European Union. But now they're stuck in a recession and they can't devalue they can't use expansionary monetary policy to stimulate the economy. So there's been some talk among this party known as the True Finns that they should exit both the European Union and the Eurozone.
Okay, excellent. I've read the first paragraph of your paper so far, and it's a description of what it's like in the wintertime to travel north overland from Helsinki to Lapland. And it reminded me of getting from the Founders parking lot to Pendleton East in February. When?
So my paper's on comparing Chinese investments in Africa and contrasting that with International Monetary Fund and World Bank investments there. And I think the conclusion I came to, if I remember correctly, is that the two models are really different. So Chinese investments in the continent doesn't really pose a severe competition to traditional donors.
Okay, interesting. To traditional donors, including international financial institutions or bilateral donors or both?
Mostly traditional international financial institutions.
Yep. Okay, so but the AIIB makes investments in Asia, not in Africa.
Yes, although the precedent is already set by the ADB, so
okay.
I don't think there's that difference.
Okay, great, good. This will be fun. Nicole.
I was looking at economic integration at the San Diego-Tijuana border because that's where I'm from, so it was of particular interest to me, and challenges to that. So I focused largely on friction at the border, particularly border delays, and how a heightened focus on securitization has affected funding and policy targeting that, because it restricts movement of goods and labor and affects economies on both sides because they're highly dependent on one another.
Okay. Do trucks traveling from Mexico to the United States still have to unload at the border, cross the border, and then reload?
So a pilot program was launched a couple years ago to finally implement that part of NAFTA, allowing Mexican drivers to do long-haul trips. And a couple months ago, Obama actually approved a plan to let them start applying. But long-haul truckers and trucks themselves are much more costly for Mexican firms. So even though they're allowed to do it now, they probably won't unless border delays change, because idling at the border is really costly.
Okay.
And also if they're allowed to move goods from one area in the U.S. to another area in the U.S., because they're not allowed to do that right now. So even if they could make one long-haul trip, they'd have a second trip back that would be entirely empty. So
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. That's great. Laura.
So I also was interested in regional integration, and I was interested in evaluating the claims that NAFTA increased illegal immigration.
Mm-hmm.
So then later my research question actually had to be, did NAFTA actually do this? And I actually found out that it's really hard to disaggregate like regional integration from like previous forms of like liberalization and the monetary crisis in Mexico and economic boom in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So my paper is kind of like analyzing these claims with the expectations that NAFTA was going to lower illegal immigration, saying it did not, but saying that it's not a clear connection as to why illegal immigration increased.
Have there been any good econometric studies that attempt to disentangle these different influences?
There have been, but it was difficult comparing them because some would to it from the vantage point of how illegal immigration has been affected by agriculture.
Yeah.
Others use like different measures, so it's kind of hard to like do it across
Yeah.
areas.
Okay. Well, I could go on, but then I'd be once again cutting myself short. So thanks to everyone who's willing to share a little bit about what's in these papers. This is going to be an interesting group for me to read through. I'm not going to start grading this weekend because the weather forecast is very nice. But I'll get them back to you as soon as I can. But now, to of course, the next assignment in this course is a final exam, a take-home final exam, and that's going to be distributed next Tuesday. So to get you in the mood for a final exam, let me offer some summarizing views of what I think we've learned in this semester-long look at international economic policy. I say what we've learned because it's been a learning experience for me as well as for you. We've been surprised throughout the semester by a sequence of challenging developments, unexpected developments that have obliged us to recalibrate our understanding of what's going on. So simply over the course of this semester, there have been some potentially syllabus-changing events that we've had to absorb, including the bold new quantitative easing policies of the European Central Bank last January and February, a major departure for the European Central Bank. We talked about those, and they appear now to have modestly revived growth in the Eurozone. At least they're being branded now as a modest success. But we've also watched the continuing standoff in Europe between the troika of lenders and the new radical left government in Greece, and that standoff is still ongoing. I'll have to reconvene the class next fall. I won't be here, but you can reconvene the class next fall to see if the Greeks have defaulted or not. Then we watched this spring a scandal-driven economic crisis in Brazil, which has demoted that country from one of the shining success stories among the so-called BRICS. So which countries are the BRICS? All right. Brazil was the first of the BRICS. And Brazil back in 2010 had an annual economic growth rate of 8%. This year, in the middle of a political scandal and falling commodity prices, the growth rate's down to 1%. It's predicted to be 1% next year as well. So we've watched Brazil fall out of the ranks of the anointed back into some kind of purgatory. We watched this spring, I mentioned this already, the launch by China of its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as a clear challenge to the sister institutions, the Asian Development Bank, mostly controlled by Japan, and the World Bank, mostly controlled by the United States. And we've watched how the United States has failed so far to bully its allies into maintaining an arm's length relationship. Britain, Germany, Australia, South Korea, they've all gone with the AIIB over the preferences of the so-called superpower here in the global economy. Interestingly enough, the president of the World Bank has welcomed the AIIB. But at the political level in Washington, D.C., that's not acceptable yet because it's seen as a further indication of the rise of China and possibly diminution of U.S. influence in Asia and the Pacific. We've also watched in the last month the uncertain fate of President Obama's request for trade promotion authority, so-called fast-track authority, which may be necessary for him to complete negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is an interesting case, remember, because he's opposed primarily by members of his own party, in the Congress. Some dead-end Republicans who don't want him to have any legacy at all are also opposing, but it's mostly pro-labor Democrats in the Congress that do not want him to have this authority. And does anyone know where Barack Obama is today? No, it's in the right direction, but you got to go a little farther. Does anyone know? Emily? He's in Oregon. Yeah, he's at Nike headquarters. He's promoting a Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement at the headquarters of the infamous country that set up sweatshops all over Asia. They now mostly manufacture shoes in Vietnam, where they pay people 60 cents an hour. He's gone to Nike to promote this agreement, which is completely out of character for a Democrat. Democrats normally, if they support an agreement like this at all, the claim is it's going to create jobs in the United States. Obama knows he can't make that argument. He wants a legacy, so he's going for the backup argument. This is going to make shoes cheaper for American consumers. People are completely puzzled by why and how he's picked this strategy. Who suggested that it might work? I'm sure they've done the market research. We'll see. He wouldn't be doing it if he had another election to run for himself. So we'll watch this with fascination. And also, of course, just recently, we've watched the European struggle to come up with an appropriate response to the flood of smugglers' boats bringing labor migrants across the Mediterranean from Libya, hoping to get into Italy, and from there into the rest of the European Union. This is a human tragedy of considerable proportions. More than 1,800 people have died so far this year. 6,000 were rescued from the water just last weekend, while Renee was working on her paper on this subject. This is something it's been an occurrence every previous spring and summer for the last 3 or 4 years, and with the disruption in Africa and North Africa today, it's likely to continue. So just this semester, we've encountered a whole stream of challenging new events that call for analysis. In fact, every time I teach this course, it seems that one dramatic surprise after another challenges our learning process. And since this is supposed to be a reflective occasion, looking back over my time here, I'd like to follow this little timeline. I arrived here in the fall of 1976 and reconstruct some of the learning challenges that presented themselves to me and to my students in this class. Start in the 1970s. The first time I taught this course was the spring of 1977. Jimmy Carter was the newly inaugurated President of the United States. Some of you, I won't ask for a show of hands as to how many people actually remember Jimmy Carter. But that was a moment of international economic crisis defined by the high price of petroleum. It was called the energy crisis. It was an obsession for the Carter White House. He had us all turn down the thermostat. My students and I struggled to understand whether the extraordinarily high petroleum prices at that time were a result of the world finally running out of fossil fuels, or was it simply a coordinated production cut by the governments of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries? We learned in the fullness of time that it was neither. We learned upon closer examination that oil prices were spiking up for essentially the same reason that the price of every other commodity was spiking up at the same time. Wheat prices, chromium prices, bauxite prices, copper prices, tin prices, they all went up at the same time. The world was not running out of everything at the same time. The commodity price spike of the late 1970s was driven primarily by the monetary policies of the United States government, the lax monetary policies of our central bank, the Federal Reserve. They generated inflationary growth for a while, but eventually inflation with stagnation. It was called stagflation. that kept commodity prices sky high. It wasn't until a new chairman at the Fed, Paul Volcker, came in and after 1979 pulled in the money supply, choked off inflation and drove up interest rates. It wasn't until then that oil prices came down. And the price of every other commodity came down at the same time. So what my students and I learned from these events is that some of the most powerful international economic policy instruments aren't the instruments that journalists write about because they think they understand them, things like trade policy or investment policy or fiscal policy. Some of the most powerful instruments are difficult for outsiders to figure out, like monetary policy. And yet we have to struggle to see the role that these foundational factors play. The policies of the U.S. Fed, the world's most important central bank, are often the foundation of the epiphenomena that we try with a great deal of imprecision to understand. Of course, understanding monetary policy is a struggle for me because I'm not an economist. But I'm told I'm not alone. There's the old story that there's really only two people in the world who completely understand international monetary policy. And unfortunately, they disagree. So this will remain for me a puzzle, and possibly for some of you a puzzle, but I hope we have flagged its importance. It's worth struggling to understand. In fact, in the 1980s, when we moved into the 1980s, my students and I relearned this lesson about the importance of monetary policy, international monetary policy. During the 1980s, we spent a great deal of time studying what was called the Latin American debt crisis. This crisis, as well, was driven by monetary policy. In fact, it was driven specifically by Paul Volcker's decision to constrain the money supply and drive up interest rates. In the early 1980s, that left a lot of Latin American governments that had borrowed during the low interest rate, in fact, negative interest rate era. It had left them with debts that were completely unserviceable. Overnight, the macroeconomic environment had changed so much as to make governments that had seemed solvent look essentially insolvent. We struggled for much of that decade to help those governments out of that crisis. And my students and I learned something else from this Latin American debt crisis. When big international banks make the mistake of lending into countries where a sudden surprising change in the macroeconomy can turn those countries from being creditworthy into insolvent. When those mistakes are made by lenders, and also, of course, by the borrowers who took out loans that they, turns out, couldn't repay. When mistakes are made by both lenders and borrowers, the architecture of international financial governance typically pays more attention to the health of the lenders than to the borrowers. The international financial infrastructure came into the Latin American debt crisis worried primarily that the big banks would fail, not that Latin American governments would be pushed into painful austerity. In fact, the first U.S. policy response to the Latin American debt crisis, before we realized that the banks would have to accept some debt cancellation, the first response was called the Baker Plan, but everybody jokingly referred to it as the banker plan because it was a scheme for using taxpayer money in the United States to help Latin American governments who had been made insolvent by our Fed policies, to help them repay every penny of what they owed to mostly private banks in the United States. We've seen this dynamic since that time as well. In the global economy, I tell my students that big banks don't always win, but the powerful governments that respond to financial crises are often the governments that house those big banks. And those powerful governments are keenly aware, and I think they're appropriately aware, of the systemic risk of a cascade of big bank failures. And so they frequently design so-called bailout schemes to protect the banks first and to protect the borrowers second. The banks are indeed too big to fail. In a crisis, it's too late to worry about this. You have to help them out, or else there'll be a cascading financial collapse that will be bad for absolutely everybody. But also in the 1980s, also in the 1980s, while Latin America and Africa were struggling with their debt crisis, my students and I watched with fascination as a dramatic transformation swept through East Asia. Dramatic economic welfare gains were made by a number of previously poor East Asian countries, including Taiwan, including South Korea, including Malaysia, including Singapore, including Thailand. This became known as the East Asian miracle. We think of these countries as prosperous today. They weren't prosperous before the 1970s or the 1980s. In this period, they launched a growth trajectory that was remarkable in several respects. First, it was beneficial to poor as well as rich. This was a highly equitable growth trajectory within these countries. Second, it was not based on raw material wealth. Most of these countries didn't have any to speak of. It was based instead on investments that the governments of these countries, many of which were not democratic, by the way, investments the governments of these countries had made in human capital, that is, in the health and the education of their own citizens, and also in physical infrastructure. Roads, port facilities, electricity, one thing after another. This strategy was based on producing things that could be exported into the world market. And everything from garments to athletic shoes, to toys, to tennis balls, eventually consumer electronics. Nothing fancy, but they learned that they could train and organize a workforce that would be highly competitive in the export of these products into the world market if they disciplined their economic policies and kept exchange rates low enough, and if they avoided the import substitution temptation that had done such damage in Latin America. This was actually not a new path. It's the path that Japan had already followed to prosperity, and it's the path that China subsequently, and with even more dramatic effect, has followed to prosperity. But when we get to the 1990s, my students and I, here we entered a paradoxical time. The gains to be made from participating in international markets had become more clear, more abundantly clear than ever before. By the 1990s, the alternative model of insularity and central planning, the model embraced by the Soviet Union, had failed and collapsed. The Soviet Union itself had collapsed and disappeared. And in the Eastern European states that had previously been ruled by puppet regimes of the Soviet Union, in the Eastern European states that were previously forced into a planned economic arrangement inside the Soviet Union, these states now were free to opt for a deeper integration with the West, specifically Western Europe. And Western Europe at this time, within the European Union, Western Europe was moving forward as well to create fewer internal restrictions to trade, to create a single internal market for goods, services, labor, and capital. An embrace of a market alternative to the to the state-by-state border restrictions that had existed previously. In the 1990s, India as well was abandoning insularity and state planning. And when it did so, India's growth rates more than doubled. This was a time when market-friendly policy approaches, which were dubbed the Washington Consensus because they were approaches that were approved of by Washington-based institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF and the U.S. Treasury. These market-friendly strategies were being embraced by national governments from Warsaw to Brasilia to even to Beijing. We noticed this semester that all the talk about a Beijing consensus is mostly bogus. Political leaders in China aren't pursuing an entirely separate model of economic growth. They realize that some of the state ownership in their system is counterproductive. They're trying to gradually dismantle that, and they joined the WTO. They're even now talking about joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if we let them. China is moving more toward the traditional Western model than toward some exotic, new, non-market Eastern model. But we learned that even as these market-friendly approaches were becoming dominant among national governments, they were coming under harsh criticism from civil society organizations, including organizations promoting the rights of workers, particularly workers in industrial countries, and also organizations defending the environment against what they thought would be a reckless expansion of capitalism. These organizations began a powerful campaign against what was branded globalization. Globalization it wasn't a good word for very long, particularly around the academic community, including Wellesley College, I might say. The arguments of these critics, in fact, were at least temporarily and superficially vindicated. In 1997, when an acute financial crisis swept through East Asia and toppled the currency of one of these East Asian miracle countries after another. This seemed a clear demonstration that globalization had gone too far, that the Washington Consensus was not something you should accept or follow. And once again, in this East Asian financial crisis, the international architecture of financial governance came in and spent more time bailing out the banks than they spent bailing out the borrowing governments. This once again confirmed the bias, the so-called bias in the system that existed. So in the 2000s, my students and I spent a great deal of time arguing about whether globalization had gone too far. And about the consequences of Washington Consensus economic policies. And I frequently made myself unpopular. Of course, my students were too polite to confront me directly. But I'm not naive. I knew that I was peddling a line that went against the grain of some of my very best students who had joined what was called the anti-sweatshop movement on campus. I had problems with the anti-sweatshop movement, and I didn't mind expressing those problems. I argued, and I actually had some pretty credible economists on my side, including Paul Krugman, including Jeff Sachs. I argued that in a very poor agricultural country, the only thing worse than having sweatshops is not having sweatshops. That you shouldn't measure labor standards in extremely poor, recently purely agricultural countries against the labor standards that we maintain here in the United States. I argued that in desperately poor countries, like like Vietnam, for example, where the Nike shoes are being manufactured today, or in Bangladesh, where the only employment available is physically punishing farm work, and that's the work of children, not just the work of adults in poor agricultural societies. And it doesn't get you anywhere. It leaves you trapped in endless destitution. If that's the only alternative, the emergence of an industrial sector producing T-shirts or soccer balls or something that can be sold into the world economy, the emergence of this kind of industrial sector, even when working conditions and wages are shameful relative to what we would insist upon in a more advanced industrial economy, this can be a first step out of poverty for workers, including the young girls who often are enlisted in this kind of labor, who typically welcome these jobs. We condemn these jobs. They typically welcome these jobs as better than hoeing weeds all day long under the hot sun and not improving your status at all in the process. This is one of the hardest arguments I try to make. I'm not sure that I was ever successful, but it's an argument that I tried to make to this class. The argument that going from agricultural destitution to urban industrial development, even the earliest stages of urban industrial development, is good for human welfare. Even if it means going through a sweatshop stage of development. Sweatshops are typically the precursor to rapidly increasing individual wages and working conditions. That was the case here in New England 200 years ago. It was the case in the southern part of the United States after the Second World War. It was the case in Japan in the 1950s. It was the case in these East Asian miracle countries in the 1960s and 1970s. It was the case in China in the 1980s and the 1990s, and it's the case in Laos, in Vietnam, and in Bangladesh today. Now, my approach wasn't to reject the concerns of students who were offended by sweatshop working conditions. My effort was to try to sort out activist movements against sweatshops on the basis of whether their actions were going to improve wages and working conditions in developing countries, or were their actions more likely to halt job growth in developing countries and protect workers only in the United States. That was that was the dividing line that I tried with considerable difficulty to draw. I should say I attribute some of my personal take on all of this, some of my attitude toward international markets, to the time that I've spent doing research on food and agricultural policy in developing countries, particularly in Africa, where impoverished smallholder farmers in the countryside are impoverished in part because they're completely cut off from international markets. Most farmers in Africa live more than 2 kilometers from the nearest paved road. So their household transport still takes the form of carrying things and walking. Under these circumstances, they can't get the fertilizer that they need to increase their yields. They can't market a surplus that they might produce. Transportation costs are much too high. These farmers are completely cut off from multinational corporations, from global financial capital. They are living in an essentially unimproved, isolated condition that leaves them destitute. It leaves 1/3 of them still chronically undernourished. It leaves them with average incomes of $1.25 a day. Seeing these circumstances in my own work, I point the finger of blame at first at the governments in these countries that have utterly failed to make the needed investments in the rural public goods that agriculture needs everywhere to become more productive. The labor productivity of farmers won't go up in an environment where you don't have adequate roads, where you don't have electrical power, where you don't have an infrastructure for irrigation, where you don't have clinics, where you don't have schools, where you don't have any agricultural research stations. If governments have to provide these things, private companies are not going to do it. One of the themes that I dwell on is the appropriate role of government versus the private sector. These are public goods that private companies have no incentive to provide. If governments fail to provide them, progress is blocked. And that's been the case in Africa. In Africa, typically governments spend only 5% of their public budget on any kind of agricultural development, even though 60% of their citizens live in the countryside and are dependent upon agriculture for income and employment. So when it comes to poor farmers in Africa, my first finger of blame is pointed at the governments in those countries that, of course, are politically responsive to powerful organized urban groups, not farmers in the countryside. Farmers in the countryside are politically powerless. Most of them are illiterate. They're not politically organized. They're physically remote from each other and from the capital city. They're cut off from each other by ethnic and linguistic differences. They're women, they're children. In contrast, the cities in Africa are politically powerful. The army, the police, university students, industrialists, civil servants working in the ministries, these are all organized groups proximate to power. They're in a position to make demands on public resources. Those demands then result in investments being poured into urban areas. Nothing goes to the countryside, and progress isn't made. So when the issue is good governance in the realm of economic policy, and this is, of course, in political science, so I've got to talk about governance and what good governance is, I tell my students not to focus so much on the traits of a government. Is it democratic or not? Is it corrupt or not? That's interesting, but for the purpose of effective economic policy, I want to look not at the traits of government, but at the deeds of government. I want to know if governments are providing the essential public goods that their citizens will need to prosper in a thriving market economy. If governments provide these things, even if they're not democratic, like China, or corrupt, like China, if governments provide these things, I'll give them a break. If governments don't provide these things, even though they are democratic, there are a lot of governments in Latin America and Central America that are nominally, even in Africa, that are nominally democratic, that simply don't make any investment in these things. I'm much less forgiving. So I've tried this semester not to shield my students from good news. It's easy to spot the bad things that are happening, but it's sometimes analytically more useful to concentrate on the bad things that didn't happen. And one of my themes this semester has been against the common narrative that the 2008 financial crisis was a calamity in which everyone behaved badly. Most of my students came into this class believing that the global response to this financial crisis, we're now up in the 2000s and heading into the 2010s. Most of my students came into this class believing that the global response to the 2008 financial crisis was uncoordinated, inadequate, and unsuccessful. But I assigned readings that took a different view, readings that reminded us of what didn't happen after the 2008 crisis in New York. There was no continuing cascade of big bank failures. That was blocked in part by effective central bank coordination between the United States and European countries, and between the U.S. Treasury and counterparts in Europe. Swaps and loans were extended to shore up the public finance posture of governments that were trying to avoid these collapses. There was no Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States. After the 1929 stock market crash, the United States jacked up its tariffs in order to protect domestic industry. Other countries did the same thing. There was a tariff war. Nobody was better off. Economic activity simply contracted. That led us into a deeper, decade-long depression. This time around, there weren't any competitive currency devaluations to speak of, as there were in the 1930s. In fact, in this particular crisis, China revalued its currency upward. China also participated in the stabilization effort with a huge stimulus program. And India did the same thing. So the newly rising BRIC countries, instead of acting as spoilers, were acting as supporters of a counter-cyclical policy response to this implosion of credit and the risk of a deeper decline in economic activity. The 2008 shock actually was bigger in magnitude than the 1929 shock. It was bigger in magnitude. And it wasn't like the East Asian financial crisis. It didn't happen in Thailand. It happened at the epicenter of the world's financial system. It happened on Wall Street. Despite all of this, thanks to an effective coordinated response by everyone from the IMF to the Treasury Department to the European Central Bank to the obscure institutions in Europe that you've probably never heard of, the 2008 shock didn't lead to a decade-long global depression. It led to a severe and painful recession, but one from which we're recovering. Even, in fact, Europe is finally recovering. And this is important, the mistakes of the 1930s were not repeated after the 2008 crisis, even though the international system didn't have a single, clear, dominant, hegemonic leader, which was the minimum requirement that Charles Kindleberger had laid out when he wrote his famous essay back in 1973. It's what I was taught when I was a graduate student. If it's Pax Americana, where we control everything, we can prevent a crisis from creating a depression. Or Britain in the 19th century, Pax Britannica, they can prevent a crisis. They can be the buyer, the seller, the lender of last resort, the guarantor of everything. By 2008, the United States wasn't a single, clear, dominant, hegemonic leader. And yet, the stabilizing tasks were performed by a coalition of major economic powers, something that political scientists would be surprised to see, something that, well, you'd have to take the course to understand why it happened, and it's too late for that. So overall, the lessons learned from this class, including this semester, have been, I hope they've been reassuring about the recent past and also looking toward the future. I've argued that most economic problems of outright deprivation are on their way to being solved. This is not something that I would have confidently argued when I started teaching back in 1976, and I'm pleased to have worked over these decades to see this more optimistic pattern emerging. When I started teaching, life expectancy at birth in the least developed countries was only 45 years. Now it's 55 years and steadily increasing. When I started teaching in 1977, almost half of children in South Asia under the age of 5, almost half of children under the age of 5 were stunted. They were stunted and underweight, almost half. Now it's 20%, and that percentage continues to decline. When I started teaching this course in 1977, infant mortality rates in sub-Saharan Africa were more than 200 per 1,000 live births. Now they're down to 144. Not 200, but 144 per 1,000 live births. And they continue to decline. This is sensational progress that it's been rewarding to witness. In fact, I was particularly pleased 2 years ago when the new president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, said it should be our goal to eliminate extreme poverty worldwide by the year 2030. Eliminate extreme poverty. He measured extreme poverty in terms of earning less than $1.25 a day. He wants that condition to disappear by the year 2030. Your first reaction is, well, that's preposterous. But then if you look at some of the trend lines, in spite of phenomenal population growth in very poor countries, the number of global citizens living under extreme poverty has fallen from 2 billion in 1990 to 1 billion today. So we've fallen by 50% since 1990. If we accelerate that trend just a little bit, we can reach this seemingly impossible goal. We know how to end extreme deprivation. Markets can't do it alone. Governments can't do it alone. Markets working with governments. Governments providing the public goods and the proper regulations. Markets providing the innovation and the initiative. Working together, in most places, markets and governments are on their way to achieving these objectives. There are some things, though, that we don't yet know how to do. Some things that we don't yet know how to do. For example, overcoming the growth in global inequalities between industrial countries and less prosperous countries. Most new wealth is quite naturally and understandably created in the countries that are already the most prosperous, because they're the ones that have the well-trained human capital. Think of Wellesley graduates, for example. They're the ones that have the mature infrastructure. They're the ones that have the stable political systems. They're the ones that have financial resources. All of these things become a magnet for enormously productive new investments. Countries that lag behind don't have these magnets. And so no matter how rapidly they grow, they're growing from a much smaller base. And their total accumulated wealth simply doesn't catch up with the total accumulated wealth of the countries that started growing first. As wealth gaps continue to widen between, let's say, Europe and Africa, or between the United States and Central America, we don't yet have a known politically acceptable method for closing that gap. The improvisation that's being tried today is labor migration, some legal, some illegal, from countries without wealth into countries that have enormous wealth. I'm in favor of that. I think that is a wonderful way to make a start on closing these gaps. But it's clearly a second best solution because of the political resistance that it encounters. And another unsolved challenge. This is a completely different unsolved challenge. This is the unsolved challenge that we ended the semester with in our course. This challenge is no longer one of overcoming scarcity or reducing deprivation. This is a challenge brought on precisely by our success in overcoming scarcity and our success in reducing deprivation, the enormous vitality of economic activity around the world, including in countries that are newly prosperous, like India and China. In these countries, there is an abundance of fossil fuels available to provide energy, particularly coal. As these countries pursue an objective of welfare gain, they access these fossil fuels, and the consumption of those fossil fuels produces greenhouse gas emissions that have now left us with more than 400 parts per million in the atmosphere on our way to 450, at which point disruptive climate change becomes unavoidable. I sometimes wish we were running out of fossil fuels, but we're not. We're not. All the talk about peak oil, bogus. Bogus. We have 3 times as much proven reserves of coal, gas, and oil as would be needed to push us above the 450 parts per million concentration in the atmosphere. We don't even have to find any more. If we burn what we've already found, we've gone over that particular limit. My students and I spent the last 2 sessions of the semester pondering how we might respond to the greenhouse gas emissions problem, which is being driven precisely by the success that we've had in bringing down poverty. So there are plenty of problems left to solve and plenty of lessons left to learn if this course continues to be taught after my departure, which I hope and I trust that it will. And as a final word, I would just remind my students that the open book exam will be sent to you next Tuesday, and you'll have 72 hours to complete it. But long after that exam is done, I would implore you to use and to build upon what you've learned about the politics of the world economy, to create and construct for yourself a role in that economy that you can be proud of. This is an arena where your talents can be put to enormously good use. And in pursuing that goal, don't let my retirement stop you from asking me for recommendations, for employers, for graduate school, for whatever. This is the modern age, and I may no longer be at Wellesley, but I'm still just one short email message away. So please feel free to do that. So thanks again. Congratulations on a wonderful semester, and for the seniors, I'll see you at commencement. Thank you very much. 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 Congratulations, thank you. Congratulations, thank you very much. Can I open this now? Thank you very much. That's great. Made in Bangladesh. Thank you very much.